He was homeless, a forgotten veteran living on the streets, until one night he ran into a burning mansion and saved an entire family. But what they discovered about him next would shock everyone. This is the story of James Harris. Courage, redemption, and the power of a second chance. The city never sleeps. Its lights blink like restless eyes, watching, judging, forgetting. Among the cold glow of neon signs and the steady hum of passing cars, a man walked alone, quiet, tall, and wrapped in a coat that had seen better years. His name was James Harris. To most people passing by, James was just another homeless man. Invisible, unimportant, another body blending into the shadows of the city. But if you looked closer, there was something about him that didn't belong to the streets. The way he carried himself, the firm shoulders, the measured steps, the constant awareness in his eyes, told a different story. He was not just surviving, he was enduring. James had once been a soldier, a proud, disciplined, and fearless black man who had worn his country's uniform with honor. Years ago, he'd stood tall in the deserts of Iraq, his hands steady on a rifle, his heart burning with purpose. He had fought for a flag that promised equality, dignity, and homecoming. But when he returned, there was no parade, no warm embrace from the world he had defended. There was only silence, and a system that didn't see him anymore. He had applied for jobs, dozens of them. Some interviewers smiled politely when they saw his veteran badge. Others just frowned when they noticed the scar running down the side of his face, a gift from a war most people had already forgotten. One manager even told him, "You look too intense for this place." That's how they said no. Bills piled up. Medical expenses from old injuries drained what little savings he had. Then came the eviction notice, folded neatly, taped to his door, like a final salute from the life he'd lost. James tried to hold on. He volunteered at shelters, fixed cars, carried groceries, helped strangers. But life in the city was merciless. Before long, his home became a cardboard mat behind a gas station. His meals came from the generosity of strangers, or the back doors of restaurants where leftovers were thrown away like secrets. Still, James never begged. He refused to let the world take his pride. Every morning, he cleaned his face in a public restroom, straightened his worn coat, and stood tall. He might have lost everything, but he was still a soldier, and soldiers don't surrender. Sometimes, at night, he'd sit under the bridge where the traffic rumbled above like thunder and stare at the skyline. The city lights flickered like distant stars, and he'd whisper, "Maybe tomorrow." The streets had a memory of their own. They knew his footsteps. The police officers nodded when they passed him, some with pity, others with respect. The street vendors greeted him like an old friend. Kids would wave, calling him Sergeant J. He was poor, yes, but not forgotten. Not completely. There were moments when memories haunted him. The faces of his brothers in arms, the sound of gunfire echoing in the night, the sharp smell of burning sand. But what hurt the most wasn't what he had seen overseas. It was what he saw here, the indifference, the coldness, the way people's eyes slid past him as if he were air. He had fought for them, and now they couldn't even look at him. One afternoon, while rummaging through a trash bin behind a diner, James found an old newspaper. On the front page was a photo of a smiling family, the Robinsons, a wealthy couple who had just bought a historic mansion on the city's outskirts. The article called them symbols of the new American dream. James stared at their photo for a long time. Not out of envy, but curiosity. He wondered what it felt like to have a home again, to feel safe, to wake up to warmth instead of the bitter kiss of cold air. He folded the paper neatly and kept it. Not because he cared about fame or wealth, but because it reminded him of something he'd once believed in, that every family deserved safety. Every person deserved peace. That night, as he lay under his blanket of newspapers, the wind whispered through the alley, carrying the distant sound of laughter, music, and life. James closed his eyes and imagined a world where he could belong again. A place where he wasn't invisible. He dreamed of his mother's voice, soft, loving, saying, "Baby, remember, you were born for a reason." He didn't know what that reason was anymore, but deep down, he felt it wasn't over yet. Something was coming. As dawn broke, James stood by the roadside, watching the city awaken. Cars zoomed past, people hurried to work, coffee cups in hand, eyes fixed on their phones. No one saw him, but he saw them. Every detail, every motion, every sign of life. He adjusted his coat, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "Still here, Sergeant, still standing." He didn't know that within days, his life would change forever. That destiny was waiting for him in the form of fire, chaos, and redemption. The streets might have forgotten his name, but the universe hadn't. Somewhere beyond the morning fog, fate was already moving, preparing a test that would remind the world who James Harris truly was. And when that moment came, he would rise, not as a homeless man, not as a forgotten soldier, but as something greater. A hero, reborn from the ashes of neglect and pain. The city was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. A thin fog rolled down the streets, curling around the lampposts like pale smoke. The moon hung low, its faint light reflecting off the puddles on cracked concrete. James Harris sat in his usual spot near the edge of an alleyway, his back against the brick wall. He had found an old blanket earlier that day, torn but warm enough to fight off the chill. With an empty coffee cup beside him and his small backpack tucked under his arm, he closed his eyes and tried to rest. But sleep rarely came easy. Not on nights like this. The city never truly slept. It only whispered. Sirens in the distance, a car alarm, a stray dog scavenging for scraps. James listened to it all like an old symphony. Chaotic, imperfect, but somehow familiar. Then came a sound that didn't fit. A faint crackle. He frowned, lifting his head. The sound grew louder, sharper, followed by the unmistakable scent of burning wood. At first, he thought someone was burning trash again, but then came the scream, a child's scream. James was on his feet before he even realized it. His instincts, the old soldier's reflex, kicked in instantly. He scanned the skyline. To his left, behind the gas station, a red-orange glow flickered in the dark. The air was thickening with smoke. He started running. His legs, tired from years of walking and hunger, now moved with purpose. His breath grew heavy, but his mind was clear. As he turned the corner, his eyes widened. A mansion, elegant, tall, with white stone walls and ivy climbing its gates, was on fire. Flames clawed through the windows like living beasts, devouring everything in their path. The night sky pulsed red with their fury. A crowd had already gathered on the street, phones out, recording. Some shouted for help, others stood frozen. The fire crackled louder, windows shattered, and smoke poured out in thick black waves. "Has anyone called 911?" James shouted. "They're on their way," someone yelled back. But that wasn't fast enough. Through the smoke, James saw them. A woman crying on the lawn, her face streaked with soot, clutching a little boy. "My husband! My daughter's still inside!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Without thinking, James ran toward the gate. "Sir, you can't go in there," a bystander shouted. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. His boots hit the gravel hard. His heart pounded in his ears, louder than the roar of the flames. He reached the front door, its handle glowing red-hot. He wrapped his sleeve around his hand and yanked it open, the heat blasting against his face like a wave of fire. Inside, the air was chaos, smoke, falling debris, the creak of collapsing wood. James dropped low, crawling under the haze. "Hello?" he shouted. "Can anyone hear me?" A faint cough answered him. "Help, please." He followed the voice, up the stairs, through the choking darkness. Flames licked at the walls, paint bubbling, wallpaper peeling. He found her, a young girl, no older than 10, crouched under a table, clutching a stuffed bear. Tears streamed down her face. "It's okay," James said, his voice calm but urgent. "I'm here to get you out." "Who are you?" she cried. "Someone who's not leaving you behind." He wrapped his coat around her small frame and lifted her into his arms. The staircase groaned under his weight as he descended. Sparks rained down like fiery snow. He could barely see. His eyes stung, his lungs burned. But he kept going, guided only by memory, instinct, and courage. A loud crack split the air. A beam collapsed behind him, flames exploding upward. James turned his body, shielding the girl with his back. His coat caught fire, and he smothered it against the wall, teeth gritted in pain. He made it to the door just as firefighters arrived. The crowd gasped as he stumbled out of the smoke, clutching the girl tightly. The mother screamed her daughter's name and ran to them, collapsing in tears as she took the child into her arms. James fell to his knees, coughing violently, his lungs screaming for air. 2 firefighters rushed forward, spraying foam and shouting commands. One of them grabbed James by the shoulder. "Sir, are you all right?" James could barely answer. "There's another one. Inside." The firefighter looked at him, startled. "Are you sure?" "Father. Upstairs." Without hesitation, James turned back toward the house. The firefighter tried to stop him, but James pushed forward. "I'm going," he rasped. "He's not dying in there." He disappeared into the smoke once again. Inside, the flames were worse. The roof was beginning to give way. Through the haze, James spotted a man lying unconscious near a doorway. The father. He grabbed him under the arms, dragging him toward safety, inch by inch, step by step. Every muscle in his body screamed. His skin burned, his throat was raw, and his vision blurred. But he refused to let go. He pulled the man out of the doorway just as the ceiling behind them collapsed in a storm of sparks and fire. By the time he made it outside again, the fire trucks had fully surrounded the mansion. A firefighter ran forward, helping him lower the unconscious man to the ground. Paramedics rushed in with oxygen masks and stretchers. James staggered back, coughing hard, his chest heaving. The little girl saw him and broke free from her mother's arms. "You saved my daddy," she cried, running to hug him. James tried to smile, his voice hoarse. "That's what heroes do, right?" The crowd that had once just watched now applauded, their faces filled with awe. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A homeless man, forgotten by society, running into a burning mansion to save lives. The reporters came later, flashing cameras, asking questions, but James had already slipped away. He didn't wait for attention or praise. He simply picked up his backpack and disappeared into the night. As he walked down the street, the orange glow of the fire still flickering behind him, James whispered softly, "Still standing, Sergeant." He didn't know it yet, but that night, that act of selfless courage, would be the spark that changed everything. Because the family he saved would soon discover something that would shake them to their core. The man they owed their lives to wasn't a stranger. He was someone connected to their past, in a way none of them could have imagined. The fire was out by morning. The grand Robinson mansion now stood silent, blackened by smoke, windows shattered, the air thick with the scent of ash and regret. What had once been a symbol of wealth and pride was now a wounded shell, scarred but still standing. Inside an ambulance parked nearby, the Robinson family huddled together, shaken but alive. Mrs. Robinson clutched her daughter close, tears streaking her face. Her husband, David Robinson, sat beside them, his arm bandaged, his mind spinning in disbelief. They had survived because of him, because of the man who had disappeared into the night before anyone could even say thank you. Later that afternoon, as the firefighters packed their gear and the reporters dispersed, Mrs. Robinson approached the chief on site. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "the man who saved us. Do you know who he was?" The chief shook his head. All we know is, he said his name was James. No last name. He refused treatment and just walked away. Walked away? She repeated, stunned. Yes, ma'am. Some people do. Heroes don't always stay for applause. Those words lingered in her heart. That night, the family stayed in a hotel, the soft beds and warmth doing little to calm the storm inside them. Mrs. Robinson couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, covered in soot, eyes filled with quiet strength, the way he had carried her daughter through the fire. Who was he? And why did his face seem familiar? The next day, after ensuring their daughter was resting safely, Mrs. Robinson drove back to what remained of the mansion. The morning sun filtered through the smoke-stained air. She walked through the charred entryway slowly, her heels crunching over glass and ash. The house was quiet now. The chaos had turned into eerie stillness. As she passed the hallway, her eyes fell on the wall where generations of the Robinson family had hung their portraits, sepia-toned photographs, medals, and framed memories dating back nearly a century. Her gaze lingered on one frame that had survived the fire, hanging crookedly on the wall, its glass cracked, but the image untouched. It showed a group of soldiers, proud and determined, dressed in uniform. And there, in the middle, was him. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same scar down his cheek. It couldn't be. She leaned in closer. Beneath the photo was a brass plate. Sergeant James E. Harris, United States Army, awarded Medal of Valor, 2007. Her breath caught in her throat. James Harris. Her knees nearly gave out. The man who had saved them, who had walked out of the flames and vanished into the night, was the same man honored on their family's wall. But how? Why was his picture even there? She remembered the story her late father-in-law used to tell at family dinners, about a young soldier who had once saved his life overseas. If it weren't for him, he would say, I wouldn't be here to raise my family. He'd promised that one day, the Robinson family would find a way to thank that soldier properly. That soldier was James Harris. Mrs. Robinson's eyes filled with tears. It was as if destiny had brought him back. Not for repayment, but for redemption. The man who had once saved her husband's father had now saved her family too. When David Robinson returned to the house later that afternoon, she met him at the doorway, holding the photograph. David, she whispered, you need to see this. He frowned, taking the frame from her hands. His expression shifted from confusion to shock as recognition dawned. This is the man from last night. Yes, James Harris. He's in your father's military album. David stared at the image, his throat tightening. My father used to talk about him. Said he owed his life to a man named Harris. I thought he was long gone. Mrs. Robinson nodded slowly. He's not gone. He's out there, living on the streets. David lowered the frame, silent. Guilt washed over him, heavy and suffocating. He had spent years building his business, chasing status, ignoring the faces of the homeless he passed every morning on his way to work. And now he realized one of those faces belonged to the man who had saved his entire family, twice. That night, David made a decision. They would find him. For 2 days, he drove through the city, downtown alleys, bus stops, parks, showing James's picture to anyone who would look. Most shook their heads. A few pointed him toward the riverbank, where the shelters were. Finally, outside a small soup kitchen, he saw him. James sat on the curb, hands wrapped around a paper cup of hot coffee, his face tired but calm. His clothes were still singed from the fire. David stepped forward slowly, unsure how to begin. James Harris? James looked up, wary but polite. Yeah. Who's asking? My name is David Robinson. You saved my family. James's eyes softened with recognition. Your wife. Your daughter. Are they okay? They're safe. Because of you. There was a long pause. The city noise faded into the background. I saw your photo in our home, David said quietly. My father. He served with you, didn't he? James nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Your old man, Lieutenant Robinson. Good man. Brave heart. Took a bullet for one of ours. I just made sure he got home. David swallowed hard. He never forgot you. James shrugged. War leaves marks on all of us. I was just doing my job. But you didn't have to do this, David said, voice breaking. Running into that fire? You could have died. James looked away, his voice soft. Maybe I just needed to feel like I mattered again. The silence between them was heavy. Not awkward, but sacred. Two men bound by history and fate, standing on opposite sides of fortune. David took a deep breath. You don't belong out here, James. Come home with us. James hesitated, shaking his head. I don't need pity. This isn't pity, David said firmly. It's gratitude. It's time you were seen for who you are. A hero. James studied his face, the sincerity in his tone. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. The faint warmth of being seen. After a long moment, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. Just for a while. As they walked toward the car, the city lights flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow over the man who had once been forgotten. James Harris, the soldier, the savior, the homeless man, was going home. He didn't know what awaited him there, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone. Morning sunlight broke through the smoke that still lingered in the air. The once grand Robinson mansion was now a charred skeleton. Its tall white pillars blackened, its roof collapsed, its beauty reduced to ruins. Firefighters moved through the wreckage, spraying foam and water, while police officers cordoned off the area. James sat on the back of an ambulance, his hands trembling slightly. His clothes were burned in places, his hair singed, but his eyes were steady, alert, alive. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around him, but he barely felt it. His mind was still inside that burning house, hearing the screams, feeling the heat against his skin, smelling the thick smoke that had almost stolen his last breath. He'd done it. He had saved them. The mother, the father, and their little girl, all alive. But in his heart, there was no pride, only quiet exhaustion. Mrs. Robinson approached him, tears streaking her face. She was still clutching her daughter, who refused to let go of the teddy bear James had saved. Sir, she said softly, you saved our lives. You risked everything for us. Why? James looked at her with tired eyes and said, because that's what you do when someone's in trouble. He didn't say ma'am. He didn't bow or smile. He just spoke truth, plain and human. The husband, Richard Robinson, came over too, his expensive shirt now covered in ash. He looked at James for a long moment, searching for words that didn't come easily to men like him. Thank you, he said finally. You're a hero. James gave a small shake of his head. Just did what anyone should have done. But Richard knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have run into a burning mansion to save strangers, especially not someone the world had turned its back on. As reporters arrived, camera crews began setting up, hungry for headlines. Homeless man saves wealthy family, one shouted. Another reporter pushed forward, asking, Sir, can we get your name? James hesitated. He didn't want fame. He didn't want pity. He wanted peace. But before he could answer, Mrs. Robinson said, His name is James. James Harris. The name carried weight. Strong, grounded, almost regal. When the news aired that evening, the story spread like wildfire across the city. People were moved by the image of a homeless veteran rescuing a rich family. Donations poured into veteran shelters, and strangers spoke his name with newfound respect. But for the Robinson family, the story wasn't over. A few days later, as cleanup crews cleared the wreckage of the mansion, Mrs. Robinson wandered through what used to be her living room. The floor was covered in ash and broken glass, the walls still damp from the water hoses. She picked up fragments of picture frames, porcelain, and memories. Then she saw it. A photo frame lying face down beneath a pile of debris. The glass was cracked, but the picture inside was still visible. She wiped off the ash, and her hands began to tremble. It was a military photo. A group of young soldiers standing together, smiling in their desert uniforms. And there, right in the middle, was James Harris. She froze. Her breath caught. It was the same man who had pulled her from the fire. Younger, proud, wearing the same determined expression he had that night. But what made her knees weak wasn't James himself. It was the man standing next to him in the photo. Her husband, Richard Robinson. She ran outside, clutching the photo, shouting his name. When he saw it, his face drained of color. He took it from her hands and stared, his fingers shaking. That's impossible. Richard, she whispered. You knew him? Richard looked at the photo again, disbelief and shame swirling in his eyes. I did. Years ago. We served in the same unit. James Harris was... He was my commanding sergeant. Silence hung heavy in the air. The memory came rushing back. The desert sun, the sound of rotors, the mission that had gone wrong. James had been the one to drag Richard to safety after an ambush. He'd taken shrapnel to the face because he refused to leave a fellow soldier behind. Richard's voice broke. He saved my life. Twice. His wife stared at him. And now again. The weight of realization hit him like a blow. When they'd returned home from war, Richard had used his family connections to climb the corporate ladder, to build the wealth and comfort they now had. But James, he'd disappeared. Richard had tried to find him once, but the war had scattered them all, and life had pulled him toward ambition and privilege. Now fate had brought them together again, in fire, in salvation, in debt deeper than words. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He replayed every detail in his mind. James's quiet composure, his refusal to take credit, his simple humility. He saw the irony clearly. The man society had thrown away was the same man who had once led him with courage and honor. In the morning, he made a decision. He drove to the shelter where James had been taken for medical recovery. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and hope. James was sitting by the window, bandages on his arms, staring outside. When Richard entered, James turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Sergeant Harris, Richard said quietly, emotion cracking his voice. You probably don't remember me. James's eyes softened just a little. Robinson. Lieutenant Robinson, right? Richard nodded, swallowing hard. You saved my life back then, and now you've done it again. I don't know what to say. James looked at him for a long moment. Then don't say anything. Just live right. But Richard wasn't satisfied with silence. You deserve better than this, he said. You deserve everything this country promised you, but never gave. Let me help. James hesitated. Pride still stood tall in his chest. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, Richard said firmly. It's honor. It's overdue. For the first time in years, James smiled. Faintly, but real. That night, as the city lights shimmered outside the hospital window, James held the photo the Robinsons had found. He traced the edges of the frame with his finger, staring at the faces of his old unit. So many were gone now, so many forgotten. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And outside, in the distance, the burned mansion stood silent. A blackened monument to fate, to courage, and to the strange, beautiful way life gives back what we think we've lost. The city was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. James Harris stepped out of the shelter for the first time since the fire. His coat was new, clean, dark, and warm, but he still wore it with the same humility as before. He wasn't a man reborn in vanity. He was a man restored in spirit. Outside, the air was crisp. The same streets that once ignored him now greeted him with nods and whispers. People recognized him, not as the man sleeping under bridges, but as the man who saved a family. "Hey, that's the veteran," someone said. "God bless you, man," another voice added. James would simply nod, quietly, his hands in his pockets. He didn't crave the spotlight. He never did. But deep down, he could feel something stirring. Not pride, but peace. For once, the world saw him. The Robinsons hadn't forgotten him either. In fact, their lives had changed as much as his. Richard and his wife Elaine had sold what remained of the mansion and decided to rebuild. Not another symbol of luxury, but a community center dedicated to helping homeless veterans. They called it Harris House. When they told James, he didn't know what to say. He stood in stunned silence, his eyes glistening as he looked at the sign bearing his name. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to deserve it. You earned it long ago." The opening day of Harris House was unlike anything the city had seen. Reporters gathered, cameras flashed, but James stood off to the side, uncomfortable with all the attention. He wasn't a politician, or a preacher, or a celebrity. He was just a man who believed in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. When it was time to speak, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he had done in years. But then he saw the faces in the crowd. Young veterans, old ones, mothers, children. People who looked at him the way he once looked at the world, desperate for a reason to keep going. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I don't know what to say," he began. "I'm no hero. I just did what I was trained to do, protect life. But somewhere along the way, life forgot to protect us back." The crowd fell silent. "When I came home from the war, I thought I'd left the battlefield behind. But I hadn't. The battlefield was waiting right here, in our streets, in our hearts, in the way we see each other." He paused, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Too many good men and women came home and found nothing. No help, no home, no hope. They say we're invisible. But I've learned something. Being invisible doesn't mean being gone. It just means the world stopped looking. But I never stopped being me." A tear rolled down his cheek, though he didn't hide it. "I used to think I was forgotten. But now I know. Maybe I was being prepared. Maybe all that pain was so I could be here today, to remind people that no one is beyond saving, not even the forgotten." The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, and people rose to their feet. But James wasn't smiling for fame. He was smiling for faith. For the first time in years, he believed that everything he had gone through meant something. After the event, as the sun began to set, James walked alone along the street. The light hit the city's glass towers, turning them gold, almost heavenly. He stopped in front of a store window and caught his reflection. For a moment, he didn't see the scars, or the tired eyes, or the weight of the past. He saw a man who had faced fire, both literal and spiritual, and walked out stronger. Behind him, little footsteps approached. It was Maya, the Robinsons' daughter. She held her teddy bear, the same one he'd rescued from the flames. "Mr. James," she said shyly, "Daddy says you were a soldier. Does that mean you're a superhero?" James knelt down, smiling softly. "Something like that, little one. But the real heroes are the ones who keep going, even when no one sees them." She nodded seriously, as only children can, and handed him a small drawing, a crayon picture of a tall man in a uniform standing beside a burning house, holding hands with a little girl. Above it, in uneven letters, she had written, "Thank you for saving me." James felt a lump in his throat. "That's beautiful, Maya. I'll keep it forever." She smiled and ran back to her parents. James stood up, the drawing clutched in his hand, the setting sun washing his face in amber light. In that moment, he realized he wasn't homeless anymore. Not because of money or a house, but because he had something deeper: belonging. Later that week, he moved into a small apartment near Harris' house. It wasn't fancy, but it had warmth: a bed, a desk, a photo of his old unit, and the drawing Maya had given him pinned to the wall. He started working at the center, mentoring young veterans who had lost their way. He listened to their stories, their anger, their fears. And for each one, he offered what the world had denied him for so long: respect. "Pain doesn't mean it's over," he'd tell them. "It just means you've got something left to fight for." Months passed, and Harris House became a symbol of hope throughout the city. A place where broken lives found healing and forgotten heroes found their voices again. One evening, as James locked up for the night, he looked at the sky, wide, endless, full of stars. The same sky he had looked up to on distant battlefields, wondering if he'd ever find home again. Now he knew. Home wasn't a place. It was a purpose. And his purpose was right here: to help others rise from the ashes, the way he had. The wind rustled softly, carrying a distant sound of laughter from inside the center. Veterans playing cards, sharing stories, living again. James smiled. For years, he had walked the city unseen. But now, wherever he went, people saw him. Not as a man to pity, but as a man to honor. And somewhere deep inside, in the quiet corners of his soul, James whispered to himself, "Still here, Sergeant. Still standing." The world had finally saluted him back. James Harris's story reminds us that heroes are often hidden in plain sight. Courage, dignity, and compassion can change lives, sometimes even our own. Thank you for watching. If you were inspired by this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Black Journey for more powerful stories from Black lives all around the world.